Friends, we are living in unprecedented uncertainty. The pandemic has brought about a tsunami of change both in society as well as business. The suddenness and the scale of the pandemic has paralyzed decision making. Companies are like deer in the headlights. But today we have with us Mr. Scott Anthony, one of the top innovation experts in the world, to help us see through the fog of uncertainty. Welcome to the summit, Scott.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a joy to be here. I wish we were face to face, but doing the best we can in 2020, right?
Yes, and I hope we meet in the near future. At the time when survival is the most priority, and all CEOs are basically just were keeping the kitchen lights on. They're struggling with liquidity issues, profitability issues, supply chains are being revamped, they are protecting their wallet share and market share. Innovation will be the last thing on their mind. It takes a lot of time, effort, and money for innovation. So why pursue innovation now?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things in response to that. The first thing that I would say is if you look at the historical record, it is very clear. And when you're in the middle of a big event like this, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a big recession, whether it's a shock because of a geopolitical event, whatever, those that can keep their heads above the fray, those who can think about the future, those that can invest in innovation and growth are the ones that will create substantial separation between them and their competitors in the future. It is very difficult, no doubt, but there are great rewards for people who can do it. If you look back at the global financial crisis a dozen years ago, it's the moment when Adobe starts a bold strategic transformation that gives it a decade of growth. It's the moment when Lego makes the bold move to expand globally in different ways, and it gives it a decade of growth. It's the moment when 100 unicorns are created, organizations like Airbnb and Uber and many more. So there's tons of opportunities. Then the second response is innovation need not be risky. It need not take a long time. It need not be something that's a crapshoot. If you manage it in the right sort of way, it's something that can have reasonably quick impact and you can dramatically lower the risk related to it. Is it predetermined? Of course not. There's always uncertainty behind it, but it's something that if you look at it the right way, a lot of the reasons why people don't do it end up being myths and illusions rather than the realities of innovation.
So the hard truth about uncertain times is that there is no returning to the what was. It's just the way forward. You talk about developing a future rack strategy. How do leaders go about conceptualizing and then executing it?
It's on the one hand pretty simple. I mean, of course, the doing is always a more difficult thing than talking about it. But future back strategy is exactly as the name describes. My colleagues Mark Johnson, Josh Suskowitz described this in their recent book, Lead from the Future. You live life present forward. You do strategy future back. You imagine a future world, not tomorrow, but you go further out, 5 or 10 years into the future. You look at the underlying trends that are taking place today. You imagine what that world of the future will look like. You come up with a viewpoint for what you want your organization of the future to look like in the midst of that changed environment. And then you work backwards to today to determine the specific things you need to do to build a bridge between present reality and future aspirations. And there certainly are people who say, well, how can we do this when everything's been thrown up in the air? But the reality is what the COVID-19 pandemic has done is dramatically accelerated in many cases trends that were inevitable anyway. The idea of being able to work remotely, the idea of managing things digitally, the idea of virtual experiences, healthcare systems rearranging so there was more telehealth, more ways to have things done at the fringes. All of these were trends that were underway anyway that have just happened a lot faster because of the pandemic. Of course, there are things that have been dislocated as well, but a lot of what you're seeing now, if you had the foresight to imagine the future, were things that you were ready for already, and you then accelerate your response to change rather than say, what do we do? So that's the basic idea. You imagine the future, you design your organization of the future, you work backwards to today, and you start moving.
How has the CEO response been? You speak to a lot of clients, and you must be seeing the response of a lot of companies across your client base and also in the universe. How has the typical CEO response been in this pandemic?
Vinod, I would categorize CEOs into 3 different buckets. So you have one group that pretty much is frozen. And I understand this. I mean, this is a big moment. We've not seen something like this in our lifetimes. And we still don't have certainty about what the future is going to hold. So it's a very human response. You get those that kind of freeze like deer in headlight. You get those who look down, who say, okay, there's so much going on. There's so much uncertainty. I'm going to focus on the things I feel like I can control. So I'm going to get really into nitty gritty operational related details. I'm going to go and tackle the problems of the present. Then you get a third group, which I would say is a minority group that recognizes you got to deal with the problems of the present, but they have an eye or two eyes that are looking at the horizon and asking, what kind of opportunities are opening up because of this? We have observed, if you look at economies all around the world, people have talked about various letter shapes, V and W and U and L and all that. Right now, the letter that you see is a K, because there are some things that are doing really well. So if you're Zoom, obviously this has been a great time for you. And a lot of electronic tools have boomed because of this. If you're an online education provider, it's a great time for you. On the other part of the K are people who are on the inverse situation. So while Zoom is Zooming, some of the big airlines obviously are not. Online education is great, face-to-face education is not. But you can do great things no matter where you are on the K. If you're on the upslope, you say, what do we do with the pandemic premium that we've earned? So we have this special moment where we're getting extra normal returns. What opportunities ought we to invest in right now to continue our growth? If you're on the downslope of the K, it's a moment where you say, let's step back, let's reset, let's rethink, let's reimagine. As the saying goes, never waste a good crisis. You probably would have had to do that anyway. Now is a moment where no one's going to blame you for doing something pretty radical. And again, it comes down to the CEO's mindset, being willing not to just get caught up in the here and now, but think about the then and there.
See, events like these actually, I mean, they change consumer behavior and consumer preferences. And like you said, there are some opportunities even in this environment. But companies, they have to adjust themselves to the new reality or be irrelevant. How do companies make sure that they are relevant in these dislocations? I mean, in India, we've seen retail go through a tremendous change, like globally through entertainment, hospitality. They are in deep trouble, but they will have to adjust to the new reality. I mean, how do companies react to the new dislocation?
Yeah, there's a couple frameworks that we've described in our work that we've found to be very helpful as you deal with today's uncertain times. One of them is one of our bedrock frameworks. It traces back to the research and writing of our co-founder, the late great Professor Clayton Christensen. And this is the idea that people don't buy products and services, they hire them to get jobs done in life. So in other words, people don't go and buy a product, they go and find an answer to a problem that they face. And it happens to be your product that they buy, but it's really that they're trying to solve a problem. They're trying to get a job done. The reason why this framework is so helpful to you is you can understand, as you've had this disruption, not Clayton Christensen definition disruption, but a dictionary definition disruption, how does that change the way people are thinking about different solutions? What constraints are there and what they can do? How are the hiring criteria that they use rearranged? What are the barriers that stop them from consuming? What are the newly available solutions? What solutions can they not access? And you can meet consumers or customers where they are in their new circumstances. It can also help you think about what temporary changes are going to stick. So we've been in a period where we've been forced to experiment with new solutions. You can predict very easily if the solution that you've experimented with is better than what you used before, you will keep using it. As an example, we have learned that you can do really good things via Zoom. That is going to persist. If the solution is worse, you won't keep using it. When Singapore reopened its schools in the beginning of June, our 4 children were first in line to go back to physical schools, as well as the schools did to try to do virtual learning. It just doesn't compare or compete. So that's one thing that helps you understand. And then you think about how are customers rearranging in their minds how they're considering solutions. It's a reasonable bet to think that things related to immunity, reducing the amount of contact that you have, will persist well after the pandemic. So what does that mean for the future opportunities you have? As mentioned in the beginning, history shows clearly there are always opportunities, no matter how dark the times. those that can think of the second order effect of the pandemic will be really well positioned to grow. First order, we needed more PPE, we needed more ventilators, Zoom needed to work, et cetera. We got all of that. But what's the knock-on effect as we think about rearranging how offices work, rethinking how we do meetings, rethinking education, rethinking what are the benefits that are in consumer products, rethinking how we do distribution? There are still plenty of spaces to innovate and grow if you think about the job to be done dislocations that have a high likelihood to persist.
One of the surprises of this pandemic has been how well the companies have taken to the new work from home paradigm. Nobody expected this, but it's worked out quite well. How do you see the workplace evolving post COVID?
Yeah, my own personal view, and one always wants to admit expertise. I'm not a deep expert here, but this is my own personal view just from watching companies and seeing different parts of the world moving at different paces and thinking about this from the lens of our own organization. Innosight is a growth strategy consultancy. We're about 100 people. We're owned by a bigger diversified consultancy called Huron, which is about 3,000 people. So also looking at the way we're thinking about these issues going forward. To me, it is very clear that there will be some permanent and lasting changes. It is very clear that more meetings, more discussions, more gatherings will be done virtually because it works and it has lots of benefits. It is also very clear that we're not going to go fully digital. We're not going to go fully dislocated because there are certain things that are notably worse when you're doing things over video conference or over Zoom. Collaboration doesn't work as well. Spontaneity doesn't work as well. It's easy enough to maintain community and culture, but it's really hard to build it. So I think we're going to end up with something that looks like a hybrid sort of model where a lot of the people that I'm talking to now are saying, we still want to have physical space, but we want it to be something where people will gather sometimes, but we have less of it so that we've got more budget to invest in more collaborative space or places or spaces where we can all gather for formal time so that we can go and exchange ideas and so on. So I think you're going to see that happen. I think my own industry, consulting, I predict that's what most consulting companies will do. You are already moving towards hoteling inside most consulting companies. I think they will take that to the extreme and say, why bother with physical offices? Instead, let's use co-working space so that whenever we need to have a team get together, we can do it. And once every fortnight, once a month, once a quarter, whatever, let's get everyone together for a day or two and really build that community. So I think you are going to see some places that radically reconfigure, but I don't think we're going to go so far to say, let's do this 100% of the time. I don't think really anybody wants that. I know I don't.
So, in your new book, Eat, Sleep, and Innovate, you talk about unleashing the natural innovator inside everyone. Can you share some mantras with our audience, basically, how they can help, the leaders can help restructure and basically reimagine their business?
Yeah, so the basic idea in Eat, Sleep, Innovate is pretty simple. It again starts with this idea that everyone's got an innovator inside of them because everybody's a human and once was a child that did these things naturally. So we define a culture of innovation as one in which the behaviors that drive innovation success are habits. They come naturally. So we say ideally you want your organization to have people who are curious, who are customer obsessed, who are collaborative, who are adept in ambiguity and are empowered. Those are the behaviors that enable innovation to succeed. And the enemy that you have to recognize is what we call institutionalized inertia that powers the shadow strategy. Not what you say you do, but what you actually do on a day-to-day basis. And all of that exists to make today better. Innovation is something different. So the institutionalized inertia, the shadow strategy, is the enemy of innovation. So that gets to the basic tool that we suggest in the book. If you're trying to break inertia, you're trying to encourage new habits, rip a page from the habit change literature and go and plant what we call a bean, B-E-A-N. The B-E stands for behavior enabler. This is to help people do the hard work to adopt a new habit. You give them a checklist, you give them guides, you give them coaches, you create a ritual, etc. The artifact and nudge is the indirect way to help people adopt new habits without them consciously having to think about it. Visual reminders, having things like leaderboards like you see in video games that get people motivated to do new things, changing physical office design to nudge new behaviors and so on. In the book, we list out 101 different beans. The Tata's Dare to Try prize is one relevant in India, a well-known thing that Tata Sons does to give a prize to somebody who tried to do something that didn't work. a very visible way to celebrate intelligent failure, and 100 more in the book to help people overcome the inertia, encourage the behaviors, and get all the great returns that come when you drive innovation through your organization.
But you say that to spot and seize opportunities in crisis, it is important to avoid the battle of beliefs. The problem is in any uncertain situation, leadership has to be decisive. Decisive leaders comes from beliefs which has worked for them. How do you manage such a situation? I mean, that
Yeah,
was
yeah, it's again a great question. So the battle of beliefs, the problem that we see inside organizations is when you have this new thing that you might do, and person A says, "Well, I believe it's a good idea." Person B says, "I believe it's a bad idea." What do you do with that? A battle of beliefs, it's like talking about religion or politics. You really can't go anywhere with it. So what we always try to tell people to do is to turn it from a battle of beliefs to a battle of assumptions. So the reason why I think this is a bad idea is because my assumptions are X, Y, and Z. The reason I think it's a good idea is I agree with you about assumption X, but I've got a very different view about Y and Z. Okay, so we've got assumptions that are different. We can then go and design an experiment where we figure out not who's smarter, because it doesn't matter how smart you are, you just have assumptions, but whose assumptions were more correct. And you're never going to get to 100% proof. One of the things that Colin Powell would do when he was in running various pieces of the US military was known as the Powell Doctrine, which is you get to about 70% certainty and then you trust your gut. 70% is an important number. If it's less than 50%, you might as well flip a coin. If you wait until 100% certainty, it's too late. You already should have acted. So you've done enough so that it's not just a belief that's not grounded, but it's something where you've got the evidence to support the assumptions behind what you're doing, and you're willing to take not a leap of faith, but a step of faith. And that is something that is required when you're dealing with uncertainty.
play the long game and permanent adaptable. I think that's the key message that you left us with. Thank you, Scott. Thanks so much for spending time out of your busy schedule. Thank you so.